We're hosting this in partnership with the Post-Carbon Institute and with Richard Heinberg, who's our keynote speaker today. We're also hosting this in partnership with two organizations as our hosts, Food Strong and the Little Africa Food Collaborative. And we've really appreciated their support. We're also hosting this in partnership with local organizer Glenn Gall, who's been working on this event for months and pulling together all of these speakers. And we're so appreciative to Glenn for all of his work on this event. We feel that this is a landmark event. To our knowledge, there's no other conversation that's taking place like this in the country. And we are really pleased to bring this to you today. We hope that you'll be both inspired and challenged to take what you learned today back to your homes and your neighborhoods. We'd like to thank our sponsors and our partners for participating with us. And we'd also like to thank Jess Vallejo for being willing to provide our land acknowledgement. Jessica is the secretary of the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance, and she's the board member of the Lake Erie Native American Council. And I'd like to acknowledge and introduce Jessica to give us the land acknowledgement for our event today. Jessica?
Just having trouble coming off of mute. Thank you. I'm going to turn my camera on now.
Welcome.
Just like to welcome everyone to this traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, we can see you,
Welcome.
Jessica. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. And we welcome you to Cleveland, the land of the traditional Haudenosaunee Confederation. And today, I would like to offer you this welcome in the tradition of my people, the Dene, the Navajo. And so I say, welcome. Ozo Nahazli is a concept commonly referred to in English as walk in beauty. Ozo Nahazli means that we are covered in beauty, and that the request from the earth today is that we are covered in all that is above and below and in all around us. We remember in the memory of the earth that we are beauty and that we go forth in beauty, and may we always walk in beauty. It is beauty again. And in this way, we open up the space, everyone to be safe, but also to acknowledge that in this time, in this space, and this place where we are right now, very important to recognize that the wind is blowing around me. And the spirit is here in affirming in all of our existence, and that this time and space that we share together is blessed and sacred in this circle. And I'm still waiting for the wind. We acknowledge the earth. We bring back to focus our connection to it. And we grant this special time and this place to that form and our unity and our relative connection to each other. And so to just give a little understanding to the folks that are involved here in this circle now, a land acknowledgement is simply not enough to know that we are here, that we are still here, and that Indigenous people are still here in this land as it's connected to us from birth. And that a land acknowledgement without reparative justice work in our communities is nothing more than a performative act. And so I've offered this opening and this blessing in a more traditional way that our communities would welcome visitors into our homelands. And so I welcome you all to Cleveland today.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, Jessica. We really appreciate this. Very special. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce you to Jessica Alvarez-Parfrey. And Jessica will be our moderator for today. She has a background in community organizing, nonprofit fundraising, and environmental activism, and she's the executive director of Transition US. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for being our moderator today.
Thank you, Louise. From one Jessica to another, thank you, Jessica, for helping us to begin this program in a good way. I was also really excited to see your connection to the UMA community. I'm also a descendant of UMA people, and it's beautiful how we all find ourselves here together. I also want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to keep my opening remarks a bit short so that we can begin our program with our keynote featuring Richard Heinberg, who I've had the pleasure of working with before. I was actually raised in Ohio. So I was born in California. I moved to Ohio at the tender age of 4.5. And I remember mourning deeply the loss of the connection to the ocean. And I remember taking a trip to Lake Erie. And I think this was an early part of my critical awareness of my place in the world and how we were treating our natural systems. But I remember vividly this experience of going to Lake Erie. And I think there had been some efforts to do some cleanup, but then being confronted with the reality of dead fish floating in the waters and sitting there. And so I think that kind of helped to kick off my awareness of our place in this web of creation and the role and the responsibility that we have to tend to the land, but to tend to one another and to again, return to right relationship. So this theme of redesigning our communities for life after fossil fuels, I'd also like to add redesigning our communities for life after extraction, because extraction happens in a variety of arenas, from, again, the ways in which we interact with our economies, the ways in which we interact with culture, and again, the ways in which we interact with Mother Earth. So it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Heinberg, who will help us to open up the program. Richard Heinberg is an American journalist and educator who has written extensively on energy, economic, and ecological issues, including oil depletion. He is the author of 14 books and hundreds of essays and articles. He is presently serving as the senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute, and he is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He has delivered hundreds of lectures on energy and climate issues to audiences on 6 continents, addressing policymakers at many levels, from local city councils to members of the European Parliament. In addition, he wrote and narrated Post-Carbon Institute's animated video, 300 Years of Fossil Fuels in 300 Seconds, winner of YouTube's Do-Gooder 2011 Video of the Year Award, which has been viewed by nearly 2 million people and translated into multiple languages. We are very pleased to welcome him here today. And Richard will give his remarks, and then we'll have space for Q&A. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Jess. And I'll share my screen here. Okay, so over the next 20 minutes, what I hope to do is walk us through an overview of the human predicament in the 21st century. So this is a big picture context, so that we're kind of all on the same page, and it's a big picture that I've been working on for about 50 years. So I'm happy to share it, and I'm happy to have questions afterward and your comments too. So the context that I like to put everything in is the context of power, because power is everything. In the simplest meaning, a physicist would say power is the rate of energy transfer. Okay, but what do we do with energy? Well, everything we do. So the ability to do something is power. We speak of the power of flight, the power of speech, and so on. But when we talk about power, we're also concerned with social power. So if power is the ability to do something, social power is the ability to get someone else to do something. And we humans have become not only the world's physical power champions, but also social power. We've been developing social power in various ways for tens of thousands of years. We have horizontal social power, where we just self-organize to do things. And we also have vertical social power, which is based on incentives and threats. It's a kind of, when I say vertical, it's a kind of pyramid of power with a few people at the top telling lots of other people what to do. But power is not just human, it's everywhere. It's a thread that ties together basically everything in the universe and everything in life, everything in ecosystems. So if you want to understand something, follow the power. Sometimes people say, well, follow the money. Yeah, but money is just a proxy for power. And it's why pay attention to the proxy when you can follow the real thing? Life is incredibly powerful. When I was doing research for my book, Power, I was astounded to find that gram for gram, the average organism is 10,000 times as powerful as the sun. How could that be? Well, do the math. Of course, life is getting its power from the sun primarily. There are a few minor exceptions. And the sun is generating its own power, but nevertheless, living things are extraordinarily adept as a result of the evolutionary processes over long periods of time, extraordinarily adept at gathering and exerting power in order to survive and do the things they want to do. And as I said earlier, humans have become really the power champions as a result, especially of a few achievements and developments we've made over the last, really tens of thousands of years. The ability to control and make fire gave us the ability to do all kinds of things, including control environments, change environments so that the kinds of plants and animals that we wanted would grow there. Tools, all kinds of tools, clothing to enable us to live in places that we wouldn't otherwise inhabit, and language especially, which enabled us to communicate to one another across space and time to coordinate our behavior. So up until roughly 10,000 years ago, human societies were operating mostly by horizontal power, everybody just cooperating together to do the things they needed to do. But since about, again, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, we've seen the development of more vertical social power in human societies, primarily the result of grain agriculture, which enabled the accumulation of surpluses of food that could be stored a long time, which were then objects of raid from other groups of people. So war becomes a big catalyst in the ramping up of competition between societies. And then the development of the state about 6,000 years ago was really a crucial juncture, because from that point on, we get the development of money, metal weapons, communication technologies, and social complexity, full-time division of labor, including slavery. So society has never been the same since. 6,000 years is an eye blink in the time that human beings have been around, but it's been a very fateful period of time. Now, since we've had state-based societies with cities and money and all these other things, we've seen the tendency for societies to arise and collapse. And social scientists who've studied this, especially in the last 10, 20 years, using big databases of quantitative information about hundreds of human societies, have come to pretty much agree that collapse is kind of a normal periodic feature of these kinds of societies. So we go from 6,000 years ago up to fairly recently, and we get a gradual accumulation of more and more wealth, societies getting larger, more powerful, but then something happens that nobody could have predicted that changes everything, and that's the advent of fossil fuels. It required some prior developments, private ownership of natural resources, protections for investors, and so on. But once those things appeared, it became possible for humans to start extracting and using fossil fuels. And this changed everything because fossil fuels were enormously concentrated sources of energy developed by nature over the course of tens of millions of years that we could extract relatively easily and use them for all kinds of purposes. This is what agriculture looked like before fossil fuels. This is what agriculture looks like with fossil fuels. So you notice a lot more people here than here. It used to take 90% of the population to produce enough food to feed everyone, including, maybe that 10% who would live in cities and take on specialized occupations, doctors and lawyers and soldiers and writers and all the rest. And everybody else was farmers. But with fossil fuels, it only takes 1 or 2% of the population working full-time at agriculture to feed everybody else. So guess what? The biggest demographic trend of the last 100 years has been urbanization, people moving to the cities and taking jobs in the middle class. But this is, I use this little graph from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, farm jobs as a percentage of total U.S. jobs. And that tells some of the picture, but the use of the word jobs is really, it hides more than it reveals, because did 90% of the people in the US have farm jobs in 1790? No, they were small landholders or big landholders in the South with plantations, or they were enslaved persons. Very few people had farm jobs. The whole idea of employment, having a salary or hourly wages, this is recent stuff. I mean, you can find examples going back in history, but the idea that, most people would live that way would be totally alien to somebody in the 1790s. So we've developed this thing called the economy as a result of fossil fuels. And this is a picture of the economy from Investopedia. And I added the little question at the bottom, what's missing here? Producers, consumers? Well, that's it, right? Well, where does all the stuff come from that we manufacture and sell? It comes from the earth. So the whole idea that there are limited natural resources and limited waste sinks doesn't even come into conventional economic theory. Of course, they have to make room for it occasionally just because it's so obvious, but it's not part of the worldview of most economists. So we've developed the idea that the economy should always grow. Because of fossil fuels, the economy has grown with more and more cheap energy, concentrated energy. We've been able to do more things. We become more powerful, and there are more of us. So this, the economy grows, and we look at that. Economists look at that and they say, well, that is normal. That's natural. But what does economic growth actually mean? Anything that's growing at a certain percentage rate over time has a doubling time. If it's growing at 1% per year, it doubles in size every 70 years, at 2% every 35 years, and so on. So economists say, well, the economy should grow at 2 to 3% per year. That's just normal. That's natural. That's what we should aim for. But that means the economy doubles in size about every 25 years. So every 25 years, we use twice as much raw materials. We produce twice as much waste. That's insane. And yet that insanity is taken as absolutely normal. This is global energy consumption or usage, again, since around 1800. And you can see what an incredible ride it's been. I was born in 1950. And as you can see, right around 1950, there's an inflection point where we really started using a lot more oil. And from about 1950 to about 1975 was the period of the fastest economic growth in all of human history, by far. It was also a period of the fastest growth in population and GDP. And, well, if you put these things side by side, energy consumption, population, GDP, and carbon emissions, it's It's a pretty familiar pattern. So what could be wrong with all of this? We're getting more stuff, more powerful, more population, more control over nature. Well, it was a bargain with the devil because it all depended on fossil fuels, which are depleting finite resources. And as we burn them, we release carbon emissions, changing the climate and making it harder for future generations and other species to persist. So we've been aware for some time that climate change is a problem, and the scientists who study this are telling us that we have to decarbonize our economy very quickly, totally by 2050 or even sooner. But what does that actually mean? Can we do that? I've been studying this for many years. I collaborated on a book on the subject called Our Renewable Future. And our conclusion from that study was, it's possible on the drawing board, on the laboratory shelf, but in the real world, not so much. One problem is that solar and wind produce electricity, which is great. Electricity is a very useful energy carrier, but we only use 20% of our energy in the form of electricity. The other 80% we use in form of liquid, solid, gaseous fuels. So when you hear that a particular company or community is going 100% green energy, usually what that means is 100% renewable electricity. A lot of that coming from hydro usually. But that other 80% is just ignored. That's energy, but we use words so imprecisely. We should be if we mean electricity, we should talk about electricity. Why? Because there's a lot of things that are going to be very difficult to electrify. Like this is a cement kiln that produces cement for concrete. Concrete is literally the foundation of modern industrial society. You need it for building wind turbines, for example. And this is how you make cement in kilns that operate at 1500 degrees Celsius 24/7. Can you do that without fossil fuels? Again, in principle, yes, on the drawing board, in the laboratory, but in the real world, we're very, very far away from being able to do that. Same thing with aviation, shipping, I could go on. Then there's the materials requirements for building, not just the solar panels and the wind turbines themselves, but all that infrastructure. Remember, 80% of the infrastructure that we have depends on solid, liquid, gaseous fuels, not just on electricity. So a lot of that infrastructure is going to have to be replaced with stuff that does rely on electricity or with infrastructure that makes and uses synthetic fuels. So that means we're going to have to extract raw materials at much higher rates than we have in the past. So scale is really the biggest hurdle to an energy transition. I'm not dissing solar and wind here. I'm not saying it's a waste of time and it's a terrible thing and we should get rid of all the solar panels. No, we need alternative forms of especially electricity production to maintain some vestige of electrical grids, because if we can't keep some level of grid electricity, then everything goes. Civilization grinds to a halt and billions of people die very soon. I don't want that to happen. So, but can we replace all of our energy usage? Can we continue living the way we do today? Taking vacations in the Bahamas and all the rest? No, it's not going to happen. Despite rapid growth of solar and wind, and like last year, we had the fastest growth of solar and wind in all of history, 10% growth. And yet we also set a record with the highest greenhouse gas emissions last year. So how can that be? It's because of economic growth. We're constantly demanding more energy, and the growth in energy usage is outpacing the addition of solar and wind power. So renewable energy is just adding to, it's not actually displacing energy from fossil fuels, at least yet. The only way really we're going to decarbonize the economy is to directly reduce fossil fuel usage. Stop producing this stuff and stop using it. And currently that's 85% of our energy. So of course, if we stopped altogether tomorrow, 85% of our energy would go away, and so would civilization. So we've got to do this in some kind of organized manner. But climate change is not the only thing that's going on. As a result of having so much power, we're also seeing we're using more land. So land use is resulting in destruction of habitat for other species. We're losing wild nature. 70% of the populations of, or most species populations, whether we're talking about birds, mammals, amphibians, fish, have seen a 70% decline in population in the last 50 years. So nature's just disappearing in front of us. We're depleting resources, polluting the environment, and economic inequality is growing. So what we need to do, obviously, is limit some of this overuse of power on the part of human beings that fossil fuels has enabled. Are we even capable of power self-limitation? Well, yes, in principle we are, and I go into that in some detail in the book. I even give it a new name, the optimum power principle, because you see it everywhere in nature. With predators, over time, they adjust themselves to the abundance of prey species available to them. So rather than killing all of the prey and making it impossible for themselves to survive, they actually reduce their predation to the point where there's a more or less stable relationship between predator and prey species. Indigenous societies did this all the time. And the best way to understand it, the word indigenous, is a society of people that has stayed in one place for long enough to learn the rules of nature in that place. The limits to resources, wastes, and so on. And so indigenous societies should be our teachers. They are the people who know what we need to know, what the rest of us need to know. And so what we need to be doing is learning from them and helping them to survive so that we can learn for them. We limit power in all kinds of ways. Nature limits power, as I've just said. Traditional societies did so. Even in the modern world, we do it with democracy and financial regulations and arms treaties and so on. So if we can limit our power, and we do, and there are lots of things that we must limit ourselves if we're going to survive this century: resource extraction, waste dumping, energy usage, land use, all these things. If we can do it, and those are the things we need to limit, why aren't we doing it? Well, there are a lot of reasons I could go into, but I think the key is just that we've gotten so much power so fast from fossil fuels that we took it personally. We said, oh, we must be really smart, we human beings. And if we can have it, we must deserve it. And we should assume that future generations will have even more. And of course, the economic system that we've created throughout this time, which we call capitalism, it demands more growth. So we've developed this kind of Star Trek mentality. And I used to enjoy watching Star Trek and the great characters and stories and everything. But you think about what is it actually about? It's about human beings in the future colonizing the rest of space. Wait a minute. It hasn't worked out so well just on this little planet. So shouldn't we get this little planet in order before we start telling other planets what to do? So what's the future of power? What does it look like the rest of this century? I think there's a spectrum of possibilities, but it's a bounded spectrum, right? From collective self-annihilation to sufficient self-restraint. What you will normally hear from most economists and politicians and so on is, well, we're just going to continue to grow population and consumption throughout the rest of this century. Technology, AI, all the rest is going to make it possible to do absolutely everything. We'll be colonizing other planets and so on. I don't think that's a realistic possibility this century. You know, either we're going to get ourselves in order so that we're living within the limits of this planet, or it's all just going to fall apart for us. And it's already starting to do so, and it's going to start doing so much, much faster. So what to do? Well, we've got to fight vertical power with more horizontal power, you know, voluntarily cooperating and coordinating, building a kind of green resistance movement that includes ecosystem protection and restoration, indigenous rights, anti-war movements, building community resilience, building trust among each other by living with wisdom, integrity, courage, and compassion. We have a duty to each other and to the natural world. And the natural world isn't here just for us to plunder. We have a responsibility to it. So what this really amounts to is a kind of managed retreat from the pinnacle that industrial civilization has taken us to. It's important, I think, to start with food because that's what we all need. It's our connection with the land. It's critically important for survival, and it's going to be impacted by climate change and all the other things that are going on. So to finish, some words from my favorite philosopher, the Chinese Taoist Lao Tzu. Knowing others is intelligence, but knowing yourself is wisdom. Mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself is true power. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for kicking off the program in such a powerful way and grounding us in that reality of the weight in which this industrial society and civilization, it makes us expand in ways that are detrimental to our survival, but I'd also say it limits our imagination in a lot of ways. So creating that space for horizontal community power is critical. So we're going to open up space for Q&A. If folks have any questions, please feel free to jump in the chat or use the raise hand function and be ready to unmute yourself. And I think I'm going to get some help. I see one hand up from Timothy. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Richard, thank you for an excellent summary. You mentioned the role of war in all of this, but only sort of in passing. I actually myself have come to conclude that it plays a much more central role. And for historical documentation of that fact, I refer you to Matthew Ozano's epic tome, Oil, Power, and War, A Dark History, where he documents the role of oil in winning wars over the 20th century primarily. The point is that what we need to do right now quite clearly is essentially reallocate all fossil fuel use only for the most essential needs, which most people would agree are food production, as you've mentioned, and also the building out of a renewables electricity grid as fast as possible. That means, in particular, nobody else gets, and that means that the military doesn't get it. And that is tantamount to unilateral disarmament. Right. And as the federal budget itself shows, if nothing else, the military is really the puppet masters behind American politics and indeed global, much of what goes on around the world. I hate to say this, but I think we're not going to be able to do that massive reallocation without dealing with the use of war as a means of solving international disputes. Any comments?
Yeah, I share all of your concerns. And that's why I, when I, in one of the last slides, described the sort of deep green resistance movement, I put the anti-war movement as part of that, because if you game out how the century is likely to unfold, As resources become more depleted and as population continues to grow, if it does, the likely result will be more resource wars, fighting to see who will control the last of the available fossil fuels, water, minerals, and all the rest. If we don't want to go that way, then it's going to require people power, horizontal power to challenge the masters of war, not just in this country, but in all countries. Because as you say, if it's just unilateral disarmament, the end result of that is the countries that don't go down that path of disarmament will just conquer the ones that do.
Actually, that's not quite true. We have nuclear weapons, and they
Right.
don't take that much fossil fuels to keep them going. Nobody's going to attack us while we have those, if they're the same.
Right. Yeah. Well, we also need to de-weaponize nukes. These are weapons that, by their very nature, could themselves, bring most of life on Earth to a close. So, yeah,
I agree. But my point was that immediately we don't have anything to worry about, even if we did destroy our conventional forces.
Right.
We would be quite well protected.
Yeah.
This is the
Well, anyway, it's an important subject, and it needs to be part of the conversation. I agree.
absolutely. I want to bring Homer into the dialogue here. Homer, over to you. I see your hand up, and you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Homer Walden here. I'm the low-tech farmer. Louise invited me to this podcast, and it's really great. Thank you for having it. And thank you for asking me to. I probably have more of an answer than a question. I started farming about 20 years ago using pigs to till up my garden beds. I was given the Governor's Award in Pennsylvania for environmental excellence by not using a drop of fossil fuels. So naturally, this podcast has gotten my attention, and I just wanted to share, how I actually do that. And I put a couple of pigs in a movable pen, and I feed them waste from the produce stand. So they eat all this waste, they till up the garden beds, I move the pen, and then they start the cycle all over again. And at the end of 120 days, I'm harvesting these vegetables that the pigs planted, and I've got free food, and I don't have to buy feed pigs. So it's this crazy little system that I've been working on, and I'm writing a book about it. It's going to be called the Full Circle Farming. I wrote a book last year called The Low Tech Farmer, and that one's available on my website if anybody's interested. But I just wanted to put the word out there that there are solutions. We just have to really work for them. And having these pigs dig my garden beds up and do all the tilling, it really it changes the whole model of what what we're able to do. And it's
Absolutely.
pretty exciting, and it actually works. So
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Homer, for your comments. Just again, being mindful of time, darn linear time. I think we're gonna have some really engaging panel discussions focused on that very topic around our food systems and how we work with and relate to the land. So eager to get into that. And again, just being mindful of time and really appreciating you, Richard, again, for grounding us in this recognition of power. So we're going to be switching over to our national speakers. It's my pleasure to bring Maya Dutta into the conversation, and she'll be discussing the power of ecosystem restoration. Maya is the Assistant Director of Regenerative Projects for our host organization, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here with you all today, and will echo the thanks for Richard for his really incredible presentation, kind of setting us up. So I'm just going to do what I hope is an introductory view on the power of ecosystem restoration to kind of handle some of the challenges that we're facing. I could talk about this for the next 3 hours, but we have a lot to get into. So we're just going to do a little bit of what ecosystem restoration kind of has to bring to the table. So I like to start here with an image of the Loess Plateau, which is the site of one of the most ambitious large-scale restoration projects that has taken place. On the left is an image from 1995. On the right, the results of decades of restoration in 2009. And to me, the power of ecosystem restoration is right here. It is the ability to transform a landscape from degraded conditions to one that supports life in all of its complexity, in all of the cycles of water, energy, nutrients that kind of make us able to survive and make other living beings able to survive. We go from conditions of degradation where water doesn't run, where crops don't grow, where soil is eroded, and the human communities are experiencing this through rampant poverty and hunger, into an area of abundance where there's reliable water and food and sustenance, where biodiversity returns, where people can live kind of proper and good livelihoods in relationship to the land within those limits, but within a much greater abundance than the land once held. So how is this possible? How is this done? In short, it's by kind of appreciating and understanding the relationship between biodiversity and climate, between ecosystems and life, and kind of what makes our climate and our planet the way it is. And as Jess mentioned, I work for biodiversity for a livable climate, where the thesis is kind of in the name. We really understand the active role of biodiversity in the planet and the climate conditions. I think a common conception is that biodiversity and living things are this passive victim of climate change, just suffering from all of the things that humans are doing by putting up excess CO2, affecting the planet the way it is. But all of us are participants in our ecosystems, and everything is contributing to kind of the situation at large. We have certainly through our kind of excess power and our effects on our ecosystems changed the calculation, but in fact, these other species, and particularly having kind of robust, complex ecosystems full of biodiversity, change our ability to retain and cycle water, to cool our local and our global situation, to make best use of the sun's energy that's coming into our system. So we really need to appreciate that aspect and really treat these living beings and these healthy ecosystems as the allies that they are. A lot of this looks like shifting the focus on, any single metric, but I think particularly carbon as the dominant topic of much climate advocacy and much climate solutions, to really a systems focus, looking at a holistic way of understanding the way that life is governed on our planet and making those interventions for greater abundance, for greater resilience. So just briefly going to touch on that kind of phenomenon of carbon tunnel vision. This is a graphic from Jan Konietzko that has been circulated widely at this point, just kind of showing all of these interrelated issues that we often narrow down as a way of trying to tackle one thing at a time, trying to tackle one thing alone. But in fact, when we start to understand, the issues of climate and water, consumption, inequality, biodiversity, when we start to take these together, we also are able to look for solutions that intersect. It can be really, really overwhelming to look at these as separate issues. How are we going to solve it all? How can we manage it all? And really the answer is in understanding their overlap, understanding their interconnection. Another kind of modification on this graphic is in the Earth crisis blinkers. This was inspired by carbon tunnel vision. And this is a kind of a brief look at both the problems and then possible solutions that we can take, that if we widen our focus, we can start to use kind of these approaches, bioregionalism, of transitioning our energy usage in kind of a just and equitable way, in uniting our desire for technical and technological innovations with really communal and social innovations that change the way we relate to one another, so that we're less, playing a game of whack-a-mole of problems and instead really getting to the roots. And a lot of this that I'm speaking of kind of in general terms really echoes through our society, through our political and our economic structures, and through the ways that we kind of have institutionalized our relationships with one another, our relationships to the land, and kind of perpetuated a system of extraction, both of natural resources, but also extraction and exploitation of people and of time and of the way that we are then able to live and able to dream. So even our science, our language, our ways of understanding are largely based on domination rather than on reciprocity and mutual relationship. And I think to recognize the fact that our effects on and our connections with ecology are largely hidden, largely the sources, the costs of our food, the costs of our materials, all this stuff that we've accumulated. We don't see what goes into that, and we don't see where it goes once we've discarded it. So the question of consumption, the question of waste, when you look at plastic pollution, when you look at kind of all of these, what we sometimes classify as other effects on the environment, we can really understand this as our desire to live in an extractive way rather than a circular or restorative way. And finally, we kind of take this approach to time. We are in a culture at this point where we have so much access and so much kind of immediate power that we believe we can really live for right now rather than living in connection with the 7 generations before us or the 7 generations after us. And this is where we can really learn from and kind of follow the example of Indigenous peoples and traditions to look at abilities, kind of ancestral wisdom for being in relationship to the land and being in relationship to one another. At this point, we have talked a lot in the climate space about sustainability, but what we really want to do is to pivot from sustainability to regeneration. If we sustain the levels that we're at this point, our levels of both atmospheric carbon, but also of plastic, of kind of the trends to heat, the trends to ecosystems, that's not a very good situation. And it's not one that I want to live into for the next few decades and want my descendants to live into for centuries. So what we really need is to regenerate, to restore. A lot of us came to kind of global warming as the problem. When I first learned of climate change, it was through global warming, and we really need a cooling solution. Again, this is where the power of ecosystem restoration is really crucial because nature plays a buffering role in the earth. It plays a buffering role locally, making sure that the extremes of temperature, the extremes of precipitation, either a lack in terms of drought or an excess in terms of flood, that play these 2 roles in a cycle. Nature is able to buffer this through its cycling of water. Nature, in fact, is able to play a contributing role to a more consistent rainfall. It's also kind of stabilizes the extremes that we feel and we sense. So this is just a very small snapshot of this phenomenon of a hot summer day in the city of Melbourne, where the temperature differential between a shaded area under trees and open asphalt is about 30 degrees Celsius. And that differential is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is absolutely tremendous. And the health outcomes, the adverse health effects, the heat deaths, these are not forecasts for the future. These are things that we're experiencing now, and we have to address now. And when we look at the question of timescales, looking at emissions reductions alone will require waiting decades and centuries for a re-regulation of climate based on simply lowering or halting CO2 emissions. So with restoration, however, we can be buffering some of these effects and actually working towards a livable climate, towards available clean air and water within matters of decades rather than centuries. And this is really essential. So very briefly, looking at the problem of CO2, we can also kind of look at some of the solutions in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that is sequestered during the growing seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. The seasonal variation is kind of blown up in the corner here to show that when the Northern Hemisphere, which has kind of more land and more photosynthesizing capability, is in its growing season, we actually see CO2 levels fall. And so if we can kind of maximize and support these activities, we have the ability to sequester carbon year over year, and as well as provide benefits like filtering water, providing habitat to biodiversity, growing food, and again, kind of making our livable planet supportive of life as we know it. I won't have time to go into all of this in detail, but some of the techniques and guidelines of ecosystem restoration are wide and varied, but they include a transition to regenerative agriculture, which improves soil health, increases biodiversity, decreases, again, the flood and drought cycle, and restores small water cycle. They rely on kind of restoring freshwater and coastal wetlands, again, huge for carbon sequestration, for buffering against wildfires, and buffering against these kind of threats to extinction of biodiversity. It relies on halting deforestation and restoring and conserving the Earth's great forests. And then in our urban areas as well, kind of taking a new approach to the built environment where we're valuing water, where we're valuing life, creating pocket forests, green roofs, urban farms, and across the board, across all of our acreage of this earth, investing in our soil health, which both retains water, grows more nutritious food, is able to sequester carbon, and oftentimes does so in a way that can support community livelihood and can support the restoration of communities and people along with it. And so here, again, we have to both follow and center the leadership of local communities, particularly Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, because, what we're really doing here is training ourselves in ecological recovery, but also all of the aspects of resilience that it takes to kind of go through these intense events kind of in the present and the future, and to come out the other side. It's essential in this to work with our allies, both our human allies and our non-human allies, using the power of photosynthesis that chloroplasts have been doing for billions of years at this point. My colleague likes to say the extensively field-tested method, this high-tech work of creating biomass from carbon and water. It relies on the allies of mycelial networks of fungi underground, which support our seedlings and our vegetation, and kind of increase the fertility and the health of the soil. It relies on all of these kind of beautiful invertebrates, mammals, birds, these things, again, that we're not out there to save, but that we're out here to participate in our ecosystems with. Skip this slide, just kind of a plug for understanding the really beautiful, amazing anchoring work of native vegetation, this in particular in prairies. And I'll just briefly go over some of the indicators of success, polyculture, of diversity of species, and of kind of ecosystems increasing their complexity, and of community-centered, community-owned and led solutions. I really want to stress that regeneration is really much more than ecological. There are these opportunities to really heal what has been damaged in our societies, in our cultures, and take a look at the harm that has been done in order to repair it. This looks like intergenerational public participation. It looks like fun. It looks like giving people an ability to kind of transform their anxiety into action. And, you know, finally, I'll just say that, yes, we have to kind of contend with our limits to growth. We can't just grow exponentially, but this doesn't have to be this situation of dire sacrifice. We can really lead fulfilling, joyful, enriching, and purposeful lives, even within these difficult times, because as we participate in restoration, as we increase our connection to one another and to our planet, we can also start to open up to the possibilities of abundance for ourselves, for our friends, for our communities, and for our planet at large. So really encourage people to take part in all the ways that they can, to get involved in eco-restoration, put it in the map, and really participate in this great work of our time. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over now.
Thank you so much, Maya, for bringing the hope and helping us to stay grounded in the solutions, and reminding us that regeneration is a whole new paradigm and way of being, but we also have thousands of years of science and lived experience from Indigenous communities who know how to return to these ways of being in right relationship and are actively doing that work on the ground. So it's my pleasure to introduce Philip Bogdanoff, who is a board member with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. He's also a director for the DC chapter of Bio for Climate. And I also know him from his work as a steering committee member with the Eco Restoration Alliance. Philip, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jess, and to Richard and Maya for their excellent presentations. I'm going to go through a lot of slides very quickly. I think Jim is going to put them up for me. So starting with slide 2 with the bottom line that I want you to take away from this is that our agricultural systems, food growing systems in particular, are already being buffeted by the growing impact of climate chaos. We also at the same time are experiencing a diminishment in our availability of some of our key fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, natural gas. Those are already showing price increases. And then on top of all of that, because of our patterns of conventional agriculture, we have really extracted the fertility out of our soil. We can address some of this, undo some of it. You know, basically my argument here today is that we can reduce a lot of the waste in the system by relocalizing the production of our food. We can reduce the amount of external inputs that we need to purchase and apply by using different techniques, regenerative agriculture, et cetera, to help close the nutrient cycles. Next slide. This is just an image to give you a sense. On the left is the plants growing and animals grazing to produce our food. The arrows sort of spinning off. Some of it's for industrial uses, some of it's for storage, a lot of it's for waste. And on the right side, the edible food supply consumed, you do the ratio of what goes in to what comes out, and we're only 14% effective at producing our food. So a lot of that is because of the the large scale nature of this, the wastage that's embedded in the system because of the packaging and refrigeration, et cetera, all the energy inputs. So this is one view that we could change. Next. For the US, this is where we grow most of our crops. The yellow, green, and red, corn, wheat, and soybeans predominate. Blue is cotton, hay and silage in yellow. The bottom there, fruits, nuts, and vegetables, what are considered table crops, next slide, are really only grown in a few regions around the US. Next slide. Yeah, so this shows you mostly where our food comes from that we eat day to day. This is as of November. Things have changed a little bit thanks to the atmospheric rivers that have been hitting California. You see the next slide. There's an update from a few days ago. But still,
Okay, can you do that again?
Somebody needs to mute, please. We are still under drought conditions in many parts of the country, even in parts of California. This difference is from November to March, barely 6 months. Changes can happen rapidly. I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this as climate chaos unfolds. Next slide. So this is from last September. I haven't been able to find anything more recent, but just showing that already the unfolding climate impacts on weather has affected table crop production. Next slide is the highlights from the same article on commodity crops, saying that we're basically experiencing severe impacts on our agricultural system. The next slide is an image showing the drought. I think the slide was skipped. Yeah, global drought situation. More and more parts of the world, significant population areas are experiencing drought conditions. The next slide is showing last summer in France. Next slide shows, perhaps you saw this, the impact on the Loire River, drastic reduction in flow of water affecting not just barge transport of many goods and commodities, but also cooling of nuclear power plants that had to be taken offline, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. This is showing the change in the last few months, commodity price indices around the world from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, spiking last spring. They've come down significantly, but still the long-term trend is for an increase in the cost of our food. Next slide. This is more recent data showing the longer term sort of trend, the variability. Again, we're going to be buffeted. Next slide shows a headline I found a few days ago showing in the UK, food inflation is 18%. Next slide shows, again, this is a little bit old data from last September, but showing the impact in the US, price increases ranging from 10 to 30%. You'll notice the bottom 3 bars there are about energy cost increases. And then every time we do one of these series, I'm trying to find a little bit more pertinent data for your region. This is looking at the economic justice issue. You'll see Ohio is in the mid-range, which is still 10% of the population in Ohio are considered food insecure. Next slide shows the ratio of population to land since 1900 in Cuyahoga County, showing that the trend, the population has gone up and is declining a little bit, but the ratio of farmland is still extremely low. Different people, if you do some research, you need between 2 to 4 acres per person to grow enough food to sustain yourself for a year. So this is about 1/4 of an acre per person in Cuyahoga County. In my own region, next slide. Again, this is old data. One of the issues we have around this is there's not a lot of data tracking going on. This is from 2012 showing, kind of a random market basket of table crops and commodity crops and protein sources, showing that in DC, in some cases, less than 10% of our food is supplied from our region. Next slide shows vegetable production versus consumption in Maryland. Again, what we eat in the orange bars and what we grow in the blue. Next slide shows fruit. Again, so our region is extremely dependent upon, outside resources. Next slide. So how does it get here? Next slide shows transportation networks that deliver food in blue, and you can see the emphasis on certain regions of the country for sources and others for population centers for consumption. Somewhere between 90-95% of our food is goods in total are delivered on diesel powered trucks. Some of our food obviously comes by rail and by plane. Next slide. Our friend Alice Friedemann has written a couple of books, one called Life After Fossil Fuels, which provided some of the theme for this series that we're doing today. She also wrote a book called When the Trucks Stop Running, and she's looked at kind of just a thought experiment. Next slide. And I'll give you a minute to kind of look at this. We have created basically a just-in-time delivery system for many of our goods, including our food. You know that when a severe storm is forecast, certain items on the shelves in the grocery store disappear relatively quickly because they quickly deplete what's in the store and what's in the warehouses nearby. But we are highly, highly dependent upon this diesel-powered network. Next slide. Richard touched on this a little bit. We are, by all accounts, we had peak production of petroleum in its various forms in November of 2018. We've been on what's called a bumpy plateau. You see the decline there as COVID set in and all the shutdowns, and we've now kind of recovered. I tried to find something more recent than this March 2022. Was not able to, but by all accounts, we're still below that November 2018 peak. Next slide shows the trend over time that's anticipated based on the exploration, the discovery of huge oil fields and smaller oil fields. Takes 5, 10, 20 years to take an oil field from discovery to develop the infrastructure to pump the oil out. So there's a lag time between discovery and production, but based on that, this is the prediction, the blue, the red, and the light green there of what we were going to see from oil. Oil shale had hoped to be able to fill in that gap. It's not going to materialize. In fact, we've seen some headlines you see on the next slide in recent days showing that the downturn may have already begun. Wall Street Journal article, and then the CEO of Pioneer, which is one of the energy exploration and production companies that's involved in the shale industry. So next slide. So the question is, okay, if peak oil is 2018, we're on the bumpy plateau, we may be entering a decline phase. What do we need to do to prepare for that decline? And the Department of Energy, next slide, asked that question in 2005. And Robert Hirsch was the key author of this report that's become known as the Hirsch Report. Next slide gives his conclusions. So as Richard mentioned, the renewable industry is largely focused on generating electricity. 80% of our energy needs are in other fuels, and petroleum is used primarily in the transportation sector still, despite electric vehicles and Elon Musk's dream of electric tractor trailer truck. That's not going to change in the foreseeable future. So his bottom line are those last three bullets, that we really should have started 20 years ago to minimize the impact, to be able to minimize the impact of this peaking of oil. We have not effectively started at all. So we are unfortunately going to experience the worst of it. Next slide. Next. I think you skipped the bottom line slide again, back up one. So again, we are, our food production system is increasingly going to be stressed and buffeted. We're going to see shortages. We're going to see a need to relocalize and depend on our own abilities to grow food. And doing that, anticipating that and planning for it is going to take some time. I've been doing a deep dive with colleagues here in Maryland, looking at what would we need to do to shift from growing commodity crops, which are the primary crops, corn, wheat, and soybeans in this region, to growing more food crops. Well, commodity crops, you can make one pass at the beginning of the year to plant your seed. You maybe make a pass in the middle of the summer to apply fertilizer, and then a third pass at harvest time to harvest. And maybe you need one guy driving the combine, another guy driving the truck to collect the grain. And that's about it in terms of your labor needs. If you're going to plant, broccoli, tomatoes, cucumbers, pumpkins, a lot more labor is involved every stage of that process. And then in addition, when you harvest, say, your tomatoes, you need washing, packaging, perhaps refrigeration. If you're going to be doing anything to save that crop for over the winter, you need canning or drying operations. All that infrastructure, at least in the DC region, has largely moved west, some of it even to California. So we have to look at how do we go about recreating that infrastructure, and it takes many years to do so. Next slide. So we also need to train more farmers. There's anticipated in the next decade to be 1 million farmer gap between those retiring or dying and the entry of new farmers. We need the market systems, aggregation, distribution centers. Housing is actually a problem, providing that seasonal labor, affordable place as close as possible to farms. We need to close the loop on nutrient cycles, phosphate in particular. We flush a lot of it down our toilets. We need to capture that because it's going to become a critical resource for agriculture. So that's my snapshot. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for that context. I think will set us up beautifully for the next panel conversation. But for now, we're going to open up space for some questions. I see some hands. And Richard, if you're willing, I also want to make sure that you're part of this as well. We had to cut your Q&A a little bit short, but I did see a question from Maya. Maya, would you like to ask the question to Richard, and then we can go to Fred?
Yeah, absolutely. I just really briefly wanted, either in the chat or live, if you have some reactions, resources or recommendations for further reading on the energy transition, particularly. I know you've spoken in the past about mechanisms for doing this in kind of a just and equitable way. So would love to look into that further. Yeah, any recs?
Yeah, the literature on the energy transition is filled with a lot of misleading studies that say, all we have to do is build a bunch more panels and turbines and we can easily do it. And on one hand, and on the other hand, there are actual peer-reviewed studies that look into the materials requirements, the current rates and projected rates of deployment, and other, real world constraints and come to very different conclusions. So the general public has not been exposed very much, I would say, in books and online articles to the kind of real world constraints that the renewable energy transition is facing. I'd be happy to prepare a short list of articles. I've actually written more than a dozen of those myself, and those have links to the source materials, the peer-reviewed studies, and so on. So I'd be happy to share those.
That'd be great. And I'm sure many people would love to see that, so we can circulate that as well. Thanks.
Wonderful. All right, Fred, we're going to pass it over to you for your questions.
Yeah, I first of all just want to say to Richard, Maya, and Phil, congratulations on excellent presentations. They were really, really well done. I wanted to ask Richard and Phil, you spoke of the need for basically gasoline substitutes. And I don't know much about this particular issue, but what are the prospects of liquid hydrogen, which can be made with electricity? Is that a feasible alternative, or is it not?
It's extremely problematic. I first say that both hydrogen and batteries are not energy sources. They are means of conveying energy from one point to another. So hydrogen is either produced through electrolysis of water, which requires electricity, or it's made from stripping it out of natural gas. So you need natural gas, a fossil fuel supply to make it. Batteries as well. To charge your batteries, you need some sort of power generation to put the electricity in it. And that's the issue, the scale at which we use energy. Richard, I know you've heard Nate Hagens and others speak about this. A barrel of oil translates in terms of energy content, BTUs, into about 4.5 to 5 years of healthy human labor. Americans use about 22 barrels a year. So just for oil alone, that's 90 to 120 energy servants working 24/7. If you add in the coal and natural gas, maybe you're up around 300 servants that are supporting your lifestyle, your standard of living. If you're talking about not developing more pipelines or more oil, you're talking about reducing the availability of that energy to power our economy and support your standard of living. So we're talking about drastic changes in the short term. Hydrogen on its own has, problems with storage. It tends to seep through metal pipes, create brittle structures. Some special handling is required. The fuel cells that are being used to power electric vehicles to generate the electricity to drive the electric motors are themselves very sensitive and complex kinds of instruments. So it's not something that we really should be depending upon in the future, as our ability to repair the infrastructure that we're continually growing is going to start to reduce.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Robin, for your question.
Yeah, I wondered, because the oil companies are basically run by sociopaths willing to do anything for a fast buck, is there a danger as we switch over to renewable energies and stop the subsidizing of oil and give it to them, and they could just say, oh, fine, we won't explore anymore. We won't make any new refineries. And then when the next surge comes and we need more ships, trains, and whatever diesel fuels, the price will skyrocket like it did at the end of the pandemic, 4 to 5 times per gallon, and we'll have a whole economic collapse, and the oil companies will be happy because they're charging huge prices and still making record profits.
I'm assuming that's addressed to me, but Richard may have a comment too. I think, as I hinted, we have created an infrastructure that is highly addicted to fossil fuels. And I'm afraid that's going to have to play out. The ability to make changes in the infrastructure even if we implement aggressive policies and regulations, it's going to take decades to even reduce our dependence on fossil fuels by half. So my personal position is that rather than fight the oil companies, rather than protest the banks that are investing, I think we should be turning our energy to what is actually going to be even more critical, which is our ability to grow food to feed ourselves.
Absolutely. And so I want to call attention to some questions showing up in the chat. One is directed to you, Philip, from Judy. The question is, how is phosphate captured and recycled? Is it something that has to happen at an industrial level, or is it something that can be recycled somehow on a smaller scale? And Philip, feel free to respond live or respond in the chat if that works best for you.
So we literally flush phosphate down the drain whenever you use your garbage disposal, whenever you go to the bathroom for number 2. So we have to capture that waste stream through composting and human manure, recycling, et cetera, in order to make sure that we are be able to put it back on our growing regions.
Absolutely. Another question from Stephanie, and I'll direct this one to you, Richard. Do we have enough fossil fuels to create and maintain the green energy infrastructure that we need?
The answer to that is it depends on how fossil fuels are allocated. The only way that we do is if we allocate them preferentially to the energy transition, which would mean reducing the amount of fossil fuels available for normal consumption purposes. That means transportation, manufacturing, home heating, all the other things we do with fossil fuels. If it's going to take a very considerable amount of energy to build the renewable energy infrastructure that we're talking about, the assumption is that we're going to build a renewable energy infrastructure to more or less replace our current fossil fuel energy infrastructure in terms of magnitude, scale. If we try to do that, it's going to require energy not just for building panels and turbines, but all these other energy using machines that we depend upon. And the energy to build that stuff is going to have to come mostly from fossil fuels because that's 85% of our current energy. So unless we reduce fossil fuels going to other things and preferentially use it for the energy transition, the result is we won't have enough. Absolutely not. And the transition process will suffer. And meanwhile, everybody else will be suffering too. And they'll be saying, oh, well, we can't, gasoline's too expensive. So we demand more for that purpose. And, the whole thing becomes chaotic. Unless it's somehow managed, it's not going to work very well.
Absolutely. I want to thank Timothy for your comments in the chat and sharing of resources around phosphate. I also want to share Ann Burke's question. So what ideas are there to, 1, educate the public about the limits of renewables, and 2, let people understand the drastic changes, as Philip said, that will happen? So how do we communicate these needs to the public in a way that is engaging? Any thoughts on that? I'll pass it over to Maya. Any thoughts? Philip?
Sure. I, in fact, was like halfway through typing out an extensive response, but it's easier to just speak. I do think that it is essential that as we have these conversations and as we disseminate this information, we really need to ground this education work in actionable solutions and the ways that people can actually participate in and contribute to the transition. Because, oftentimes just hearing the dire predictions or hearing the information, we are just unable to really integrate that into our lives, into our behaviors. So yes, we need to understand. This is not to say, no, don't tell people this, but we need to understand these limits and take it further to, okay, if we can't maintain these lifestyles that we're accustomed to, what can we have instead? We can grow food. We can have, in fact, more nutritious food. We can have kind of more beautiful spaces. We can have these positive aspects as well, but we are facing real limitations. So let's start where we are. Let's see what groups are working on the ground, kind of what already exists in our community, and try to make those interventions kind of bit by bit, because otherwise I think to think of it only as these drastic changes, or especially as only levers and mechanisms that a government can make, or that a bank can make, or these external actors can make, we can't really wait on that. We need those levers as well. But to say, I'm not waiting, I'm starting now, I'm moving, I'm in collaboration with all of these other entities, and I'm going to take part in this regenerative transition, and have a little bit of faith that as we do so, we can also kind of increase that capacity, increase the horizon of possibility from something so scarce into an actual, both a livable future and an enjoyable future, something that you actually want to be a part of.
Thank you for that, Maya. And I want to, Philip, did you have anything to add?
I would just say, read everything Richard has ever written, and I'll give you a good grasp of the predicament we're in and some of the solutions. In particular, I like to point out his oil depletion protocol as something that addresses some of the justice issues globally, can also be applied locally. I like the term he's using, managed retreat, as perhaps preferable to degrowth. And I think on his last session with us, he pointed out that part of managed retreat also has to be concerned about equitable, distribution of the resources through some sort of public process for rationing. So I would highlight that. Jim Laurie has put into the chat, mentioned that phosphorus is found in most soils. Healthy soils will extract it from the rocks and trade it for the plants for sugar. So again, our global scale agriculture needs to mine phosphate from, biological sources created by, bat or bird droppings. The scale of that cannot be sustained. We need to recycle that. But Jim is also pointing out that if we downscale, focus on the local, form healthy partnerships with nature, we likely will be able to achieve what we need to.
Richard, any closing thoughts before we transition over to our next panel?
No, I think it's a great, all of this discussion is great. And I think that the focus on nature's solutions is absolutely spot on, because relying on machines to solve these problems for us, I think is going to be a big mistake. It's gotten us to a certain level of power over nature, over each other, over our environment, over our lives. But I think we're going to be learning increasingly as time goes on this century, the limits to what machines can do for us. So it's restoring natural systems and cooperating together, building community resilience. Those are the strategies that will get us where we need to go.
Again, that's a beautiful segue into our next panel conversation. I want to thank you again, Richard, Philip, and Maya, for getting such a juicy conversation going. And we will answer any remaining questions in the chat. And it also sounds like some resources after this event being sent out to folks who registered is also due. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panel and our amazing panelists. So our next discussion will be focused on transforming Cleveland's food infrastructure to rapidly and equitably increase local food production. And again, food is so critical because it's what brings all of us to the table. It's one of those things that makes us human, and the cultures that we've developed around how we feed ourselves, how we tend to the land. We have 4 panelists today, and we regret that one of our panelists, Sarah Continenza from Food Strong, will not be with us today. I would like to introduce Ishmael Samad, Mickey Smith, Jess Vallejo, and Mark White to our panel.
Okay,
Yeah, we're gonna start with asking each one of you to take about 2 minutes to introduce yourself and your current work in Cleveland. And if you have any reactions or reflection based on what has been shared thus far, we'll start with you, Ismail, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Oh, you're starting with me. Okay.
Is that okay?
No, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, quick reflections, I guess, real quick. Yeah, my name is Ismail. I'm in East Cleveland right now. Reflections are Transition Putney. I was involved in Transition Putney when we started our restaurant, the Gleanery in Putney. So there's a connection there. The other thing that was brought up by Richard, which is around the GDP work and just thinking about like the Farm Bill and how currently right now, I read an article around how Pepsi and other big ag is starting to use regenerative to actually attach the work that we've been doing to the current efforts of Farm Bill. So it's actually predictable what's going to happen about allocating the funds with all of this legwork from the ground that we've been doing and moving into corporate space. On the other side of the Farm Bill, food is medicine, same difference. So much policy has actually taken the work that we've been doing to feed communities to attach it to policy. So I'm not necessarily convinced that national policy is the way to go because of how they move. I do think that more smaller insular communities that are driven by people who are actually doing the work is the way to go. To that end, that's what I'm speaking from, is East Cleveland, Ohio. My organization is called Loiter. Loiter it takes a provocative name on purpose because you can't build community without actually being able to hang out. It's one of the only things that you can actually get arrested for, and in some instances lose your life for not fitting a social construct. And so when you start to build a community based upon spatial justice and the realities that you're experiencing on the ground, you can actually deal with some of the unprincipled policies that are put in place to actually make East Cleveland what it is right now, which is the most cash poor city in the state and one of the most cash poor cities in the country at the size. Currently, people are making less than $17,000 a year. Is 95% Black. So anything that you really want to know about environmental justice, you can just speak to people that live here. We don't really need to read any books. You just need to come hang out and get involved in the work. Because we've got to live reality that brings so much light and dignity into the space. And so we collectively invite an entire ecosystem to the work that we're doing, starting with policy work. We're working with the Harvard Law and Policy Clinic to actually create an entire policy roadmap that can be put in a municipalist way to actually make sure it's an ethos-based system that is grounded in the realities of the people that live here, creating consumer sovereignty, and also leveraging the land that we currently have in our possession. So that's what Loiter East Cleveland is. That's how I'm looking to move. That's what my reactions to what was going on. And thanks everybody for joining and looking forward to getting the conversation.
Thank you for that intro. Over to you, Mickey.
Hi, everyone. Miss Mickey Smith, and I'm the Executive Director for Little Africa Food Collaborative in Cleveland, Ohio. We have a collaborative, and that is our nonprofit umbrella where we do a lot of our programming, we do a lot of our growing. We do growing with Village Family Farms here in Cleveland, Ohio, and we've been working with Village Family Farms for the last 4 to 5 years as it relates to growing. When you talk about policy, we've worked with OFA as it relates to 2023 Farm Bill. So we have provided our what we feel should go in the Farm Bill as it relates to land, food access, right? We know that there's an apartheid that's happening in all of our communities around the world. It's just not happening in Cleveland. It's just, some of it just don't get highly, how do you say it? You don't see it, right? They hide it. And our goal at Little Africa is we take ownership in feeding ourselves. We're not letting someone else come into our communities and tell us, this is the food that you need to eat. This is what you need to do. Here you go. We're not taking that. And what we do is we teach our people. We go into the schools, we go into the communities, and we love on them. We love on them with food, right? You teach them how to grow their food. You know, we can have all the food banks in the world that comes and give you a box of food every other week, dry food. Where's the fresh vegetables? Where's the fresh food? Box. Canned food. It's nothing healthy, right? So our goal is to teach you how to take the healthy foods and how do you take them, and how do it prepare you for a better you? That's our goal at Little Africa, right? How to take the natural foods, how to take the herbs, how to use the herbs. We know that in our communities, we have diabetes, right? We have high cholesterol, you name it, we have it, but it's really centered around the food, right? He who controls the people, he's controlling them by the food. So in order to make sure that they don't control us by the food, we grow our food so we know where our food is growing. We also delve into civic engagement. So we do work in our communities as it relates to voting. You cannot come into someone's community asking them to vote for someone and they're hungry. That's not looking good, right? So you have to appeal to the people in the community, and as it relates to food and as it relates to civic engagement, it all ties in together. So we are here to do the work. Our whole goal is to have our own food hub, a food cooperative that's owned by the people that looks like us, right? In our communities, we don't own anything. We don't own the gas stations that we go to. We don't own none of the hospitals that we frequently visit. We own none of the corner stores. So, and we own none of we own maybe properties here and there, but we do not own anything. So give the people something to own. Give the people something that they can call themselves so they can take pride in their community. So that's a little touch of what I do. I'm also, I do work with Sarah Continenza. I am a consultant with Food Strong. And I'm a food educator for her as well. So I do a lot in the Cleveland space. So I just want to give you a little touch of what I do. And back to you, Jess.
Thank you, Ms. Mickey Smith. I'm going to pass it over to you, Jessica.
Hello, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I first would like to say that ahihi in my language, thank you. It is very, I'm just gonna be up front and honest right now in this space. The lack of Indigenous representation and sometimes our understanding of the universe is a completely different construct from the colonial systems that have been imposed on us. And so I will first just ask thank you for allowing me the time at the beginning to open this space with a proper welcome to the city of Cleveland, we know as the homeland of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, where now more than 25,000 Native Americans live as a product of government relocation programs and survivorship generationally from the Native people who never chose to leave their homelands here, and then also various migration programs and patterns that have led other Native folks and Indigenous to these Americas north into the land that we now call Cleveland. The original inhabitants of this space are always the people who are first forgotten when we talk about food sovereignty and land access. And when we talk about who those served populations, the demographic populations are in Cleveland that are most underserved, we are directly talking about the Native American community. I can tell you that there is very little support in our community directly from social services and agencies, organizations, and nonprofits. They do not. In my time here with the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance, our community has, like you said, Mickey, had to be self-sustainable. We've had to find ways to more or less create reparative justice in our own communities by reclaiming our sovereignty, by choosing to engage, like you said, in civic action, and also in demanding that they dismantle the racist representation of this baseball mascot that was allowed to live in our city alongside of us for 100 years and effectively erased our living history, our identities, and our individual experiences. And so the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance, our purpose is to first give dignity to the first people and a face and visibility in the education spaces that we have never been allowed to ever assert ourselves and tell our stories. And that goes along with this understanding of the universe that I was talking about in the beginning, we are not disconnected from the land that we live in. And if we live in that way mentally, we have that mental connection to where we are from, the food, and who taught us how to grow it in this land that is now called the America, confined by these borders that are not real. Then we remember who are the first people who fed the settlers and who are the ones who taught them farming here in this continent. And now we are still being starved on reservations, and in urban settings, we are still being underserved. So as the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance was found in 1993, it was in direct response to the nation celebrating its 500-year anniversary of the colonization of our homelands. So we are still actively trying to create and take up space for our communities and honestly educate on what those communities now look like, because they are multilingual, multi-ethnic, and there is not a race that we do not identify with inside of our communities as well. At this point in history, we are multi-ethnic and multiracial, and we are survivors of genocide. And food sovereignty is one of the first things that they took from us. So that's just a little about what we do. And if it's not explicitly stated already, we are an activist group and a 501c3, but we are also partnered with the Lake Erie Native American Council, which is our cultural support system for our Native American community members. These activities are usually closed to the public, and for very good reasons. We have culture classes, we have activities that people can attend, like powwows and events that we host with the metro parks or our other community partners here locally, like such as the Cleveland Cavaliers, but we do not have open cultural classes. This is not something that we do offer to the public. That is something that we have chosen to instill in our community as a way for us to continue to regenerate that culture in an urban setting where we are not able to fully and authentically be represented always. So that's just about the two organizations that I'm here today to represent.
Thank you so much again, Jessica, for being with us. I'm going to pass it over to you, Mark. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. My name is Mark White. I'm an entrepreneur and an artist here in the city of Cleveland. I'm representing today a Red All Green partnership, which I'm a founding partner of, and I have been integral in setting up a network throughout the city of Cleveland since our existence 12 years ago. So I'm thankful and grateful for the opportunity to be here today. A little bit about what we do at Red All. You know, Red All is an acronym that represents redemption, integrity, and determination for all mankind. And so our site, which is an urban farm, sits in the city of Cleveland in the Kinsman neighborhood, where we started off as an acre and a third piece of property there in one of the worst areas in the city of Cleveland in terms of disparities of life expectancy. Huge food desert there. There was said at one time recently over the last 7 years that we had a 29-year disparity of life expectancy between the people who lived there and those who lived in the surrounding community less than 8 miles away. And so the people who lived in that community were to experience less than, 29 years less life than those who lived in their proximity. And so we felt that was tragic, that we had to do something to help. And so we created a campaign to help with nutrition. And so we created a really robust information campaign, in which we believe that people are an outer reflection of an inner condition. And if you see our community and how bad it looks and how statistically poor it is, we know that it has something to do with the content of the wellness within the people. And so we sought to grow food that was nutritionally rich superfoods and begin to talk to people about how they could begin to ingest these things in creative ways. We created nutritional product lines for juices and different types of catering. We did a soul food vegan scenario where we took some of the existing recipes and tastes and likes within our community and transformed recipes into a plant-based fare so that the people could experience some of the same tastes without all of the negative effects that went along that goes along with some of our diet. And we try to deliver, even to this day, a very, very profound way that we look at regenerating our land. We believe that soil restoration and human survival is it equal each other, that we have a special symbiotic relationship with the soil, and that soil is key for us. And so we know that in order to restore ourselves, we had to restore our soil and our relationship with soil. And so many of the things that we do is soil focused. So we'll expand and talk a little bit more about this during our presentation, what we do at Red But I'm just really happy to be here and very excited to be sitting on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. My friend and partner, Ismail, his organization, Lord, I'm an executive board member of that organization as well. And we do many things throughout the city of Cleveland. So thank you for this time and opportunity. Peace.
Thank you. And it's beautiful to see all these lines of connection between y'all, and you're already collaborating. And I think that's kind of the spirit of this conversation, is how do we take back power as communities, and how do we make space for our communities to truly thrive? And so, Ms. Mickey, I heard you mention ownership and communities being self-determining. I also heard you mention, Jessica, that culture and food are deeply intertwined. And for Indigenous communities, that has been stripped away. So looking at the topic of biodiversity, I was doing a little bit of research for this panel. So we all know about the Rust Belt, but Ohio is also part of the Corn Belt, with soybeans and those big commodity crops being a huge percentage of what's produced. I wanted to ask just if there are any efforts going on to connect folks to more diverse palettes of food, especially ancestral foods. Our soils, for example, they do really well when native plants are in the soil working together. And those foods are typically healthier. You all know that stat about like an apple today, you would need to eat like 20 of them to get the same amount of nutrition that you would have to get like 40 years ago. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the diversity of the food scene in Cleveland, and what are some of the greatest needs right now? And I heard y'all already mention, but if we could spotlight that, that would be great. Mickey, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, when you think about the foods that grows in our particular climates, we're in climate 6. So we grow a lot of herbs. Yes, we do grow a lot of corn and things of that, but we grow a lot of herbs. And if you think about herbs, is very essential to a lot of the medications that our elders or some of our youth is getting when they're sick. When they talk about food as medicine, sometimes all it takes is going out in your backyard, going into the farm, grabbing a couple key ingredients, putting it on the stove, boiling it, digesting it, and guess what? Now you are healed from that. Everything, just like Mark said, we come from the soil. So if we're produced from the soil, and when things come up out the soil, we return right back to the soil. So why wouldn't we eat everything from the soil? So I say that to say, because we are in Ohio, and because we don't have certain things like mangoes that can grow here, because it's not a tropical place. We can't grow a lot of like oranges. It's hard to grow oranges here. It's hard to grow lemons here. So with the things that we can grow in our particular region, we have to make sure that we grow those and we expound on that, and we teach this is what you should be eating during these times. The problem and issues is that we are eating foods from other spaces and places that we technically really shouldn't be eating because it's not growing in our region. So does that make sense, Jess?
Absolutely. So growing foods that do well in your region, your fire region, lends itself to resilience and greater health. Awesome. I want to pass it over.
And I was just going to say, just to veggie back off of that, one of the things too, even with honey, you know, you got honey in all these stores, but they say the best honey is when you capture the bees that's in your community, because it's real central to the area in which you live in. So we have to grow specifically to our region and where we are living in. It helps keep down the allergies.
Over to you, Ishmael.
So my strategy is like reverse engineering like the current unprincipled policies that put us in this place in the first place, right? So how do you create paying markets when the community is flooded with free food? And how do you build resilient communities without having access to the funds that actually build up communities? You have to look at some of the dog whistling between the structures that actually do economic development that actually continues to displace. So what our strategy is, we've kind of like taken, obviously farmers markets are super important to our work. So we've established that, but that's not what we're centering our work on. We've purchased a fermented food company to be able to diversify the supply that has been reserved for a predictable revenue stream for people who have benefited from a predictable revenue stream for centuries, which is the Amish community. Nothing against that community, but they actually were recipients of unprincipled policies that were excluded for certain groups that came to this country to actually be able to be a part of the GDP. So we purchased a company to actually be able to diversify that economic mobility that some people in this country have been able to be a part of, to be able to include some of the properties that we actually own and have this be a more diverse opportunity for growers in the area. So we're fermenting foods. And now that product line is in 2 states. This also was started by this movement of local food, which of course is led by whites. And so fermented foods, of course, is not reserved to only white palates. And so of course we're doing kraut kimchi because that's what the company was founded on, but we're starting to introduce things like injera and different types of other flavors that are fermented all around the globe, and introducing that into the actual products that Wake Robin Foods has done. The other thing that we're doing is we're attaching some of the realities that are happening in the global South to the realities that are happening in the communities in the global North. So we actually are part of the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective. So we're getting direct chocolate from the farmers excluded from this very $80 billion extractive reality of cocoa, where cocoa is labor and chocolate is luxury. So introducing that reality to people in East Cleveland, to where people don't have the luxury to even think about the impacts of environmental justice because we're just wage slaves. And so really trying to really attach those realities to some of these global realities, connecting these narratives to people, to our distant relatives, and really bringing people to the economic realities that can happen when we have control over both the market and the land. And so to that end, we're attaching some of our efforts to the homes that are devalued in our communities. I'm sitting in a house that's valued at $28,000 intentionally only because it's 95% Black people live here. This is a house that was built in 1903, a Victorian home. If I were to take the beams off the ceiling, I could sell them on Etsy for more than the actual appraised value. So when you attach development, when you attach development of community to the actual assets that are in control, that's how we can actually create the wealth that we've been so habitually excluded from. And then we can use that as a model of how we can do that at scale in other cities that have a municipality the size of what East Cleveland is. It's not a neighborhood in Cleveland. This is a separate city that actually can create its own legislation with 5 council members to be able to have an ethos-based policy structure that can create the world that we want to see. So that's kind of how we're doing it. And so to the point around the honey, of course, we flavor those projects with the things that are happening in backyard farms, whereas we actually are adding additives to the chocolate that we're getting from people that we can pick up the phone and call and get on a Google call. Of course, that even is a whole nother thing. 42 minerals go into actually us to be able to do this call, which of course feels horrible that we actually have to be engaged in this type of conversation to get work done. So once we can actually remove ourselves from this sort of interaction, we can be smaller as a community and build from the ground up with the resources that we've extracted from, because we are a part of extraction, and then we can actually be resolved to be in community with each other to build it from the ground up. So that's how we're looking to do it. That's how we move it. We're actively kind of like just working and, having fun and meeting people along the way.
Hope y'all were writing that down. That's That's how it's done. I'm going to pass it over to you, Jessica.
Thank you. I think what a lot of people, even probably Clevelanders, don't know is that the city of Cleveland is incorporated as a city only because this is where the treaty lines ended. So literally, this is unceded territory. This land is stolen and incorporated as the city of Cleveland only because there are no native descendants here in the state of Ohio set to claim it. And that's because of Indian removal and genocide. So quite honestly, biodiversity of the land in here in Cleveland means restoring a lot of indigenous plants and the people, and that being a purposeful reparative action for our community in Cleveland in general. But as the committee sees its purpose in this work in reclaiming the land for biodiversity's sake, we want to talk about saving sacred sites that are still yet to be disrupted. And that is where we have set our focus. We do not want to disrupt the land in a way that would reproduce more harm by growing food. And that biodiversity that exists is also at a threat of being lost, because we have here in the state of Ohio, I didn't even know this until a colleague told me this today. This is agricultural and historically the land here is the oldest burial mound spaces in the entire country. And that when we do grow food, we are disrupting sacred burial sites. In Cleveland, the mound builders, and here close to the edge and the water's front, we know we're sacred sites. We know that they were villages. And in fact, the baseball team built the stadium right on top of one. So much of our land is directly tied to why we cannot feed ourselves. And specifically in certain communities, they were left food deserts. It was generationally created so that we were never able to be self-sustainable. In different communities were allowed government provided opportunities for those communities to suffer more than others because of their programming or lack of social services. And I come back to the relocation program for Native Americans. This was one that was done not just here in Cleveland, but in other cities that brought people here from reservation territory and also systematically disenfranchised them from access back generationally. Because if we do not have a tribal affiliation, we have no access to tribal government coverage. We have no access to those benefits of tribal affiliation. And if we go into urban settings, and guess what? We live amongst everybody. We are here now. And this is our community. And not always do we have the privilege to go home or the ability, because of blood quantum standards and the government's regulation of that, to even claim a tribal identity once we're second and third generation in Cleveland. Our communities are not disconnected from the Black community. We're not disconnected from the Latino community. It is included. And we are touching those surfaces in our identities. And also, we want to bring that knowledge and understanding back to that what we have left needs to be preserved. And part of that plant biodiversity comes with keeping those spaces undisturbed. For example, the Serpent Mound is always one that people want to we want to run to the Serpent Mound when something, we got to go. It's the solstice. We're going to go out there. We want to see the things. And that's a beautiful thing. But how are we preserving that land and making sure that we have that for much longer than we're assuming to, it's a flavor of the month to go out there sometimes for people because it's the solstice or it's an event that's taking place and someone is hosting something there. But there's never given a sacred identity and a protection even by our state government. The Ohio Historical Society itself does not recognize these spaces as spaces that need to be protected. So our community has to do that ourselves. And that's part of our effort to help people understand that our land is not just meant for us to consume. We must preserve it. And that our connection to the sacred sites here in Ohio is a very important one for us. Whatever we can do to recontribute to that biodiversity in those spaces, I guess that what some would call guerrilla gardening, in an effort to put native plants back into public spaces that we would otherwise not see. And it's simply seeding in public. So I guess that's a little bit about us and how we are hoping to affect that change locally. But the biggest piece is understanding that Cleveland, as we see it, and feel very entitled to saying, there's a sentiment here where everyone likes to refer to it as the land. We feel very entitled to that identity as we are from the land. Well, what does that mean for people who are from here with an Indigenous connection to the land? And how do you get an Indigenous connection to the land? If you're not Indigenous, that can still happen. But it must be first in respecting the land and knowing that these spaces are spaces that were traipsed first by other people who did it with intention. How can we do that again?
Important reminder that land and food is sacred, and that part of the power of our communities is to come together for healing, repair, reparations. These are all critical parts of the discussion. Thank you for that, Jessica. I want to bring Mark into this conversation as well for any reactions and reflections on the food scene in Cleveland and just what's needed.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So I would say, global food production constitutes the single largest driver of environmental degradation in the world today. It explains how a diet rich in plant-based foods with fewer animal source foods carries both improved health and environmental benefits. And so we really kind of, use some of this as a creative impetus for which we operate. We really, really believe in, how would you say, we call ourselves the collard green kings of Cleveland. Okay, that's one thing. One thing for sure is that for our community, we know it's very, very important that we ingest a better diet. So again, one thing that we do around our campaign of growing foods in, all throughout the year, all throughout the seasons, even in hoop houses and in greenhouses, even in the winter, we're growing greens and things like that. Cruciferous vegetables. The cruciferous vegetables, very, very high in frost resistance, right? And at the same time, very, very high in chlorophyll. And so the ingestion of chlorophyll, especially in our community, is very, very key to helping alleviate a lot of diseases. We're number one on the top of all, 10 of or number one on in every category of the top 10 diseases, And so for us, we know something like cancer is another word for that is cellular oxygen deprivation. So something like, foods heavy in chlorophyll help to alleviate, those types of concerns. We have to ingest more oxygen. We have to ingest more minerals and nutrients that we're bereft in our area. And so there are a lot of things that are tied directly into how we restore our communities, restore our soil. And at the same time, for us at Ridall, we really believe in growing relationships alongside of those plants and vegetation. We look at the farming as a metaphor because, the people are the plants and the community is the greenhouses and, and the farms in which we have to, again, fortify the soil of consciousness, where the mind is really the fertile ground for which we grow, the fruits of, another type of salvation that we can impose upon ourselves. Well, not impose, let's say introduce, to ourselves. And so this is a very, very beautiful way in which I think we can how would you say, take a different perspective, see this piece through a different lens, how we survive, how we thrive in the midst of this degradation, how we use, soil, to build, another way. So I would say from that perspective, we do a lot within our city to help also push the envelope in terms of everybody needs a farm. No farm, no food. Every community needs a Ridall. And we're just saying that from the perspective of, an institution that's going to help redeem, create integrity and determination within the people to help, take each community to another level. We keep looking for somebody to help save us, and we have to be the salvation that we're seeking. And so how do we apply the knowledge? What is, to know is not to be wise, but what we do with the knowledge is the wisdom, the application of the knowledge. And so for us, we look at it like that. So education is a major piece for us. We teach a lot of people, and we bring thousands of people through our campus to introduce them to the idea. How can we, change our community? How do we transform blight and, and trashed out areas into something that can be thriving and regenerative? And so, from that, whole concept of not just regenerative farming, but regenerative living, a lifestyle. How do we resuscitate and restore, wellness principles and activity, behavior into our community? And I would come from that perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. I wanted to ask about engagement with youth and young people who are being presented with all of these challenges in their communities, and then they get wind of the world and the impacts of climate, the economy, all of these things. Are young people gravitating towards these programs? There's a need for a new generation of young farmers, entrepreneurs, people who are invested in the regeneration of their communities. And I see them showing up. I just wanted to ask about your work with young people, young folks.
Yeah, so I'll start off with the work we're doing with youth. Again, so part of our whole approach when we first begun had to do with urban agriculture and youth education, because we understand that the youth are the foundation of the next generation. We have to understand how vital and key taking farming and agriculture out of the school system for over 30 years. And now our children really do believe that the food grows in the aisle a safe way. It grows in Giant Eagle. It grows at, whatever grocery store, is local. And we thought it very important to redirect their minds, to the soil, to hands-on application. At our farm in particular, we have a lot of programs where we engage youth, and they come down, and prior to them coming to the farm, just the information alone in the context of a classroom, it was not edifying at all for the kids. They couldn't see or relate to it, but when they come to the site and they have their hands-on, relationship, and they're able to touch, and to witness the photosynthesis and to see, the radiant light of the sun get trapped inside of a hoop house, and they understand the greenhouse effect and how it can be 100 degrees on a 30-degree day in Cleveland. And these are principles that they wouldn't really be able to grasp outside of the physical, tactile experience of being at the farm. That's why we say it's very important that we have more of these around our city and around our world. There's so many things that we're creating in our cities, and one for sure has been a lot of crime. And when we look at recent statistics, that they say that in every neighborhood where there's an urban farm or urban garden, that there is upwards of 25% crime reduction. That's huge. So we're actually growing crime reduction. We're growing many other things beyond just what meets the eye. And so I would stop there, but I would say that's very, very key, to look at through that lens.
Yeah, that's dope. So if I can jump onto that. So
yeah, come on, it's
as you just said, like, growing crime reduction is beautiful until the policymakers understand exactly what it is that we're doing for them, for the community to change over, for us to actually do all the legwork to actually reduce the crime and make it beautiful and fix the things that policies actually put us in the first place. And so for us, it's really around making sure the youth understand that, like, yes, from farming, look at what we've done, and how do we hold the power? How do we not give away the efforts? How do we not perpetually just understand that from community to community? We still can't find where it actually has been completely transferred the way that we've dreamed it up, because there's an effort to actually take away this good work that we've been doing. And so there's a bit of activism that has to happen with our children as well. And we do that at the same time on the parallel, because we're doing reformative work while we're dreaming about transformation. Right. And so they need to understand that we're doing this all together. When we do our farmers markets, they're looking at us like, man, y'all a bunch of kooks. You crazy. I mean, let's be real about what the youth think about this conversation. They think we're lame. They think we're weak. Right. So we deal with it. And when you're talking about people who our community is spending so much money to be consumers. And so we want to create things that we want them to consume. And we want it to be in a way that the consumption actually benefits them. And so I said before, if Rockefeller was if his entire enterprise and entity and all of its iterations therefore, and after that were employee-owned company, we wouldn't even know who Rockefeller was. His last subsidiary dissolved in 1980 something. So now if every one of those entities was employee-owned, we wouldn't even have this issue. And you talk about all the other 1% that benefits from just in the food industry, right? Who receives 50%, 1% receives 50% of the farm bill. If every one of those entities were employee owned, what would that mean? So again, it's about understanding like how the structures and systems are set up. So it's, yes, the urban farming is exactly what's needed for East Cleveland and other communities to just turn exactly what the culture wants it to be, a new place to experience joy that we're excluded from. And so they can continue to extract, oh, cool, you did the legwork. Now let's say we're gonna put an RFP out for the new building that's gonna look for a more mature business. This is the dog whistle. You can't be a mature business unless you're a white-owned company that can have 50 jobs to bring in, and therefore we don't get the opportunity. And that's how communities get changed over. And then you put in a $200,000 housing complex for 400 units. And you take a city like East Cleveland that is voting at 10%. That's perfect to move in a new voting block. And now you've taken back control. So again, we understand the cycle. We understand exactly what happens, and we're just not willing to let it go down. So it takes a coalition to actually like put on all of these pieces. It takes having these conversations while your kids are cooking in the kitchen, right? It takes it all, right? So it's all the whole thing. So we understand that it is intergenerational, right? And I'll say one last thing. Like I was an unschooled kid, and understanding my parents let me know very, very early that coming when the moment that you're born, you're coming into an institution that you didn't create. Right? So the hospital itself is an institution. Then you leave that institution and you go to daycare, and then you go to school, which is another institution. And then you go to, who's driving the education, and then you go into college, and then you go, and then it's like every single thing is an institution. We have to emancipate ourselves from that stuff, but that only happens until we actually have the necessary resources to build something parallel. If the resources aren't there, we just continue to look like crazy folk to people who want to consume. Right. And so that's kind of how we're doing it on the ground. So we're building the businesses with them included. We're standing up on the corner, even if like 3 youth come, right? We can have that conversation with them, and we know we're building a 7-generation city that might take 7 generations. I mean, so I know you're talking 14. I don't know. It's a lot of work to be done, and we're happy to do it because it's the work that we were called to do.
And when you think about that, oh, that was excellent, Ishmael. Thank you so much for those words. Because when you think about it from a civic aspect and the youth, right? They're not engaged. They don't believe in the policies. They don't believe in the voting. They have no faith in the systems. And again, it's systems. And we know each system has failed them. Just putting it out there, even in, we had Murtis Taylor come out and just say, hey, we can't stop the sex trafficking here. This was an institution that's telling us you can't stop the sex trafficking. So when you look at the youth, just look at what are we giving them? how are we propelling them to the next level? So from a Little Africa perspective, the way we propel our students is first, you work with them. You work alongside of them. They're not our employees. They are our peers. And that's one thing. You give them the level of understanding that we are in this together. Two, give them their own purpose. Let them find what that purpose is. Put them out there. We are shepherds. And because I'm a mother and I can speak this for our youth, we just guide them. We guide them to the spaces and places in which they want to be. We're not here to tell you all of this is, don't do this, don't go here, don't be here. But when you can propel a youth to be his highest and amazing self, or her amazing person that she is, they do more, they respect you more, right? In the farm, what we do, we give them education. We talk to them on their levels. We listen to the music that they listen to. And then what we do is we help them go through those lyrics. So while we're farming, we say, did you hear that lyric? Can you explain that to me? I don't think we want to hear that in this farm. And I don't think our flowers, I don't think the bees really like that music. So we get them back involved in the harmony of the real world, right? We break it all down to them, the real world, what they can understand, and we meet them where they are. We're not here to be we're not here to be mothers, fathers, but we still have to make sure we give them instruction. We still have to make sure we give them the lessons that's necessary, and in curriculum development. I developed a full-fledged 1-year curriculum, and I had to go be a consultant somewhere else in order to put that curriculum in. But the curriculum was tailored to high school leaders. So in order to be able to be in the space for the high school leaders, you have to develop what it is that they need and they look for. You cannot give them something that they don't care about. We continue to build these institutions. We put them in school. You got one person in front of them telling them what to do. You want them all to learn the same pace when they all don't learn the same pace. Most of them, they learn, whether they learn from hands-on, they learn from being visual learners. This is what they do. So when I tell you we have to love on them, they're going through so much, especially after COVID. Love on them, find out what they have going on personally, and then just help them find their purpose. That's what we do.
Thank you. I just feel blessed to be in this space with you all, keeping it real, reminding us we need to be resourcing communities. Folks are showing up. This is challenging. This is the good work. Jess, I want to pass it over to you. This session has just been amazing. We're not going to have time for Q&A at this point, but I could just sit and listen all day. Sure. Thank you.
Thanks. If I can talk a little bit about our youth, I think the biggest problem that we have in dealing with our youth and the psychological damage that has been allowed to occur on our community because of the identity crises that it has caused in Cleveland as to who we are. And I say that because there have been studies, and Dr. Stephanie Freiberg from the University of Michigan has the most famous one that anyone can just Google and search and read completely. That has also been backed up by several national organizations and recognized by our local community as the biggest proponent for why these Native mascots needed to change all over the country. But the psychological damage that has been done to our Native youth and our affiliated communities, I would call the Black and Latino community, is that we have an identity that has been imposed on us because of an understanding. Let's be clear. Indian is not the word that we call ourselves. And in fact, Christopher Columbus was mistaken when he said the word Indio because he thought he was somewhere else. So when we perpetuate the use of that word in itself, we have erased the identity of the people who call themselves Taino, Boricua, Dene, Yame, and continue to live in this city of Cleveland disconnected from that identity, realizing that they are indigenous people inside of this land who are experiencing a colonial identity inside of the city of Cleveland. And so we have the Puerto Rican community, the Dominican community, the Black community, the Latino community wants to call themselves separate. But here in the city of Cleveland, our boundaries and the limitations are really based on our access to that identity, of which has been imposed upon us here living in this city, being told what an Indian looks like and what they don't. And we have a lot of Black Native folks in our committee and in LENAC who definitely know that their family histories tell a different story. So our youth initiatives include first helping them understand that asserting that identity is a birthright of theirs. And it does not negate the other parts of them to say that I am Native, and to also say that I'm Black, and to also say that I'm a descendant from the island of Puerto Rico and I am Boricua. It is a beautiful thing to know that in our life as survivors of colonization, that we can be all of those things and that we can experience life in all of those ways. It's actually an eye-opening experience to know that I can walk into several places and not feel othered, okay? For our communities, that is not always true. When we are asserting ourselves in public spaces, we are not always seen as validated. We are not always asked, we are always asked to provide some kind of tribal identity or some kind of explanation for our identity. And so our work with the youth is directly connected to that psychological damage that has been done. And in first helping them understand that in connected to this land, we have always been connected to our culture and our identity as Indigenous people, and that is based on our sovereignty, which is implicit because we are native to the land. We are not tied to the government and those systems that Ishmael has reminded us that are imposed to keep us this way, right, and confined. So to wrap that up, in our youth, we really see so much activism and empowerment that there is an effort nationally. The American Indian Science and Engineering Society is a national nonprofit organization that has started what they call the Rematriation Project. And that is an effort to rematriate the land in all ways. In most of our tribal communities, there are matriarchal societies where we come and we know that patriarchy came with colonization and was imposed upon us, which is part of the reason why we are still so disconnected from our mother, the earth, and our cousins, the stars, and our brother, the sun, because that imposed ideology of what we were interacting with was also taken from us. You know, our identity was taken from us when the land was taken from us. So our youth really are recognizing that, and a lot of them are going into STEM professions because we know that this is directly the way that we can affect those environmental resources in the future, and we can reintroduce traditional ancestral ways that have been lost that we still have a connection to. And the Rematriation Project, there are several generations now of many women who are going into STEM fields, choosing to go back to their tribal communities and finding ways to create better environmental impacts and better sustainability for their communities there. For example, most reservations still don't have running water and electricity. And that is something that here in Cleveland, we do not suffer from, but having clean water is always a threat. So it is not disconnected from our tribal identity as well. We're still struggling for access to clean water and access to food and being able to grow it where we live. So that's what we see. Our youth is really taking that initiative in education, and they want to do something about it because now they feel empowered by the world recognizing our identity. It is no longer in the shadow of the racist mascot that's been allowed to exist here in Cleveland. And that in itself, the removal of that has allowed for our existence like never before.
I again want to appreciate everyone for the way that they showed up today, the work that you are doing on the ground in our communities. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and for reminding us about how we need to think about this. You all thought we were just going to talk about food infrastructure. You got to talk about everything. And those are the layers that we have to grapple with. And there is real struggle happening on the ground. We can't also just glamorize this work. But y'all are doing it beautifully. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you. All right, y'all, we're gonna transition over to our breakout spaces. These will be smaller, more intimate spaces where we'll have a chance to dive into more specific topics. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce those different rooms, and then folks will have an opportunity to choose which topic, which dialogue speaks to you. So I'm going to go ahead and name these different sessions. So in room 1, we'll have turning lawns and vacant lots into edible landscapes and urban farms. And we'll have Jamel Rakira leading that space along with Mary Keating. In room 2, we'll have education and skill building without schooling, models for the transition to life after fossil fuels. And that space will be led by Kelly Clark and Elijah Willis. Room 3, the land, which was an important thread through and through all of our different conversation spaces today, and focus on equity, justice, and access. And that space will be led by Mickey Smith and Jessica Vallejo, Angela Sales. And again, I apologize if I'm messing up names. Room 4, fire, mud, and scrap. Almost free heat for your home or greenhouse with a rocket mass heater. It'll be featuring Uncle Mud, Chris McClellan. Room 5, diving deeper into transforming Cleveland's food infrastructure with Ishmael Samad and Mark White, who were just with us on the previous panel. Room 6, we'll have East Palestine and other communities, nature's solutions to toxic land and water. That space will be held by John Wright, Kwaki, Jim Laurie, and I'll also be in that room. And when we come back to the main space after our time together in the breakouts, we'll have some spoken word poetry brought to us by Ross Solo, aka Benjamin Simmons. And I'm really looking forward to that. All right, y'all. There's never enough time in these amazing breakout spaces, and I want to appreciate everyone who's stuck with us through this program. And I believe we will be introducing Benjamin Simmons, aka Ross Solo, who is a spoken word poet, a Gullah American, a member of the Gullah Nation, founder and president of True American and Top Notch Home Servicing, and board member of Food Strong.
Jess, are we going to hear from John Scholl first?
Yes.
I guess so. I must have missed that. Apologies. John, I think you're first.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen and I will provide a link. Are you seeing my screen? Not yet. Are we good? Yes. Okay. So this is one particular project of the Eco Restoration Alliance, and you'll notice that we have a big map of the world and you're not on it. But indeed, the point of this is to have you and everyone else who's doing this important work on it. And if you're not doing this important work of regenerating the planet, then it's meant to inspire you, because to save the future, as we've heard today, we need to engage almost everyone, almost everywhere. And our way of doing it is to create a map and make it easy for people to get on the map by nominating themselves or nominating others. We have a globe, we have a map, and we have a few thousand points of light, if you will, on the map. Each of them is associated with a story, which will load momentarily. I'm showing you my prototype, and I have just discovered a problem with it. always a good idea. But as you can see, each entry has information about a particular eco-restoration project or a particular eco-restoration hero. And if you click on the panel, it zooms all the way in, gives you a little bit more information. And of course, there's a link back to more information on the web. This prototype is greatly simplified because that's really the whole story. What we would like to do with this is to include the farm, the yard, the guerrilla greened urban street corner, and everything else that will start demonstrating to people that anyone can do that and that everyone must do it, and that we're all in this together. When entries are added to the map, we will make a post into social media. We'll encourage the person who's the focus of the entry to share it with their friends, and we hope that their friends will decide to get involved also. I met just last week Mary Reynolds, who has a project called We Are the Ark, which provides specific guidance to people who want to turn their backyards into natural habitats. That information is going to show up in the map. The point is, we need a global movement, and a global movement should be able to find itself and find its peers, as well as being able to tune in on a particular area and saying who's doing what around here, and how can I support them, or how can I get involved, or how can I do this too? So that's the big map to save the future, and I will paste a link to it into the chat.
Thank you, John, and apologies for jumping over you. For folks who don't know John, he is the founder of the Eco Restoration Alliance, and as I've known him, he's very inspired by all of the different work that we're doing and trying to figure out how we can connect. So this map allows us to find each other, keep each other motivated, and support each other where we can. So thank you for that, John. All right, so I jumped the shark a little earlier, but I'm really excited to, again, recognize Benjamin Simmons, aka Ross Solo, who will be helping us to close out the program with some spoken word. And so, Ross Solo, I'll pass it over to you. I see him setting up. Okay. And oh, we need you to unmute. There we go. Awesome.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. My name is Ross Solo. I am a Gullah American from St. Helena Island, South Carolina. This is a presentation of my Gullah soul lyrics. It was recognized as original Gullah music in 2005 by Queen Quet and the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation at the National Gullah Music and Movement Festival. And I am a brief introduction to the different characters that I portray in my Papa Do persona. Here we go. Two speaker microphone, two speakers in the microphone. All them Geechee need is two speaker microphone, two speakers in the microphone. Erica, I am a Ross Solo. So yo, please lend me your mind. I gotta explain my style so I can break me down because I somewhat hard to define, and this is gonna take me some time. See, it's one of them looking for a Geechee. Well, that's what I am. You see, I say my style is mystical, but people think I bust the rhymes. Bernie Mac and Saul Williams and Eddie Murphy combined. It's that Geechee, and I did right you in on the face. Watch yourself, because I'm a mind jabbling, conscious rhyme babbling, better fasten your seatbelt because I'm a 90 Street Mayor Miles back in time traveling. Now you see me, then I'm gone. Because I'm a living, breathing time zone, a happy home for the unknown. I am Ghetto Moses telling Pharaoh, you better leave God children alone, because I'm the voice of Harriet Tubman. camouflage in the bushes. Destination unknown with both barrels locked, cop ready to rock my position, supported, prone, and Erica, I am in way, a truth in my third eye shed light. So Ross can see it, man. I am over 100 million kilowatts bright of those who got killed while crying mothers watched that night. It's the pro-black brother, but I'm not anti-white. Only ticked off at all of those who kill and those who watch in the name of one God, and y'all know that ain't right. So freaking forget your bling bling, cause boy, I bright enough to blind these haters in the still of a cat out in night, cause I'm Tourette's and schizophrenic. So yo, don't panic, cause my third party may not always be who you see. Ross a walking, talking temple for my ancestors. So I guess I am mini me, and even though Ross not bust the rhyme, yeah, I can flip modes and bust the time. And when I bust, I get busted, man, blow your mind. So watch me flow, because I go from solo to Geller Moses, from that P to the E to the Z, I eat the P-I-M-P. Because I'm a positive image manifested poetically. The man himself, yo, that's me. And sometimes when if I bless, Ross just the poet, farmer known as me, because I'm sick of this. No, I'm scared to be the rising sun, Rasta man, and I'm public enemy number one. And sometimes my ancestors bless me to be that Geechee golden child as I unfold my style. Can the congregation say, because Rasta man now, I'm bringing knowledge to life. I'm showing wrong was right, the Gullah Geechee golden child, baby. I want my knife, please. Thank you. So kind.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that sharing. It's beautiful. I'm going to pass it over to Louise Mitchell. I also want to acknowledge Louise for all of her amazing work to help make this program happen, for bringing this beautiful community together, this virtual community. Louise, over to you. You're muted, Louise.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you, Jess. And thank you so much to you, Jess, for moderating this event. You have it's just been a treasure to have you here and participating in this. Thank you so much.
She did great.
So I want to just recognize people. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Post Carbon Institute for co-hosting this event and this entire series with us. I want to acknowledge our two local host organizations, Food Strong and Little Africa Food Collaborative. I want to thank our sponsors, Mini Forest LA, Cedar Lane Ecosystem Study Group, Cottingham Farm and Villaging. And right now I just want to give a shout out to and ask folks to raise their hand. Our planning team has done a lot of work, and we have been planning this series for over a year. And I'm so appreciative of their partnership. So we've got Philip Bogdanoff, Jim Lawrenson, Natalie Wormers, Beck Mordini, Shannon Scrofano, Glenn Gall, and Jim Laurie, and John and Fred have also been helping us planning with this as well. So thank you, planning team, for your work and your partnership. We couldn't have done this event without all of this amazing team. I also want to thank our partners, the organizations that have that the speakers are representing, and they have been helping us to get the word out, and obviously gave up their time here to be here and share this wealth of information with you. Food Not Lawns Cleveland, Riddall, Kelly's Working Well Farm, Blue Rock Station, Reeds and Roots, the Community of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance, Mongol Tribe, Uncle Mud, and Village Family Farms, as well as Red Beet Row and Loiter, and of course Transition US, which is with where Jess Alvarez-Parfrey is from. So thank you so much for your partnership. Last, I want to make sure that Glenn, if you could wave your hand. This is Glenn Gall, and he has helped us for months on planning this event. I really want to thank and appreciate Glenn for all of your work, Glenn. Glenn is responsible for pulling all of these amazing speakers together. So I really want to thank Glenn for his incredible work and time.
Oh, and you're very welcome. Thank you, Louise, for pushing me the way you do. I'm
kind of the scout of all this, but I feel like an ambassador for the good work that Bio for Climates does consistently in so many ways. Check out their compendium, check out their conferences, and you know, their other resources. And I also am very grateful that there's so many wonderful resources in Cleveland. And I've known some of you for a long time and some I've just met, but boy, my heart is very much warmed, and my soul as well, by some of this greatness here. And I especially am grateful that we are getting down to our basic roots of what you know, Jess Vallejo and what she has been talking about with us, and others that have learned to decolonize and become indigenous. And I think we all need to do that profoundly to really move us forward.
Thank you, Glenn. I want to let folks know about some upcoming events that Bio for Climate is hosting. Our next course is called Ecological Economics, Finding Our Way to a New Understanding, and that's being hosted. It's a course hosted by Fred Jennings, our ecological economist, and he's having a free orientation session on Monday at 12 noon. You're welcome to participate in and find out more about our courses. With our course with Fred, and all of our courses we offer for a sliding scale. So there are multiple ways to participate. Our next GBH event, we have a series called Life Saves the Planet on GBH Forum Network. And our next event is called Damned in a Hot Chaotic World. And it's about the deconstruction of dams around the country. So please be sure to tune into that event on Thursday, March 30th at 6 p.m. And that's on Zoom as well. And whoops, let me go to the next slide. It doesn't seem to be advancing. There we go. The next events in this series are going to be in June or July. And in November, we're going to Corvallis, Oregon, which is the home of the Post-Carbon Institute, and they're going to be helping us to co-host that event along with Transition US. And then in November, we're going to Toronto, Canada to host community leaders from there. So please stay tuned and join us for those events. And I want to pass it back to Jess. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, again, just reiterating deep thanks. I'm leaving here with a very full heart. I'm feeling grounded, inspired, and I think the message of solidarity. So as we move through these different communities and look at the different ways and strategies in which folks are co-creating, thriving, resilient, regenerative spaces, and reconnecting to place in a meaningful way. Thank you. And let's keep the work up, and let's support each other where we can. Thank you again. This was an absolute joy.